How many people died that day?
Thousands. It was thousands of people perished that day.
It is the largest military operation ever undertaken in history.
Jesus Christ.
D-Day, June 6, 1944, was one of the bloodiest days in military history. Thousands of soldiers lost their lives storming the beaches of Normandy. But what happened to their bodies after the battle? It's a question rarely discussed in history books. On his podcast, Joe Rogan brought attention to this grim but fascinating reality, one that reveals the often overlooked logistics of war, the emotional toll on those who handled the fallen, and the extraordinary efforts made to honor the dead. The answers might surprise you. The aftermath of D-Day, a battlefield covered in death. But the staggering number of deaths on June 6, 1944, created an overwhelming challenge that few talk about. What happens when thousands of soldiers perish in a single day and the battle doesn't stop? The answer is as grim as it is revealing. The beaches of Normandy were a nightmarish sight in the hours and days following the invasion. The sand, once pristine, was soaked in blood. Bodies lay scattered across the shoreline, some still partially submerged in the rising tide. Many soldiers never even made it to the shore, their lifeless bodies floating in the waves, their heavy gear pulling them down into the depths. Others lay twisted on the cliffs and in the grassy fields beyond the beaches, casualties of relentless machine gun fire and artillery. The living soldiers had no time to process what had just happened. Those who survived had to keep pushing forward, securing enemy positions and moving inland. The priority was winning the battle, not handling the dead. For hours and in some places days, the bodies remained untouched, a haunting reminder of the cost of war. Yet, the sheer number of fallen troops quickly became a logistical problem. Decomposing bodies, especially in the summer heat, posed a serious health risk. Disease could spread if corpses were left unattended for too long. The smell of death filled the air, and soldiers who had just witnessed unimaginable carnage were now forced to endure another psychological burden, walking among and sometimes stepping over the bodies of their own comrades. The responsibility of dealing with the dead initially fell to those who happened to be nearby. Medics and support units did their best to gather the fallen when possible, but under continued gunfire, it wasn't always safe. Some soldiers took it upon themselves to pull bodies to safer spots, hoping they'd be given a proper burial later. Others, exhausted and emotionally drained, could do nothing but march on, leaving their fallen brothers behind. German soldiers, too, lay dead in large numbers, their bodies mingling with those of the Allies. Some had been captured but executed in the chaos. Others had fought to their last breath. While the Allies had procedures in place for handling their own dead, enemy corpses were often left where they fell, at least for the first few days. The psychological toll on surviving soldiers was immense. Many later recalled the eerie silence that followed the gunfire, a silence broken only by the wind, the lapping of the waves, and the occasional moan of the wounded still clinging to life. The horror of what they had just experienced didn't fully hit until they looked around and saw the reality. Thousands of men who had been alive just hours before were now gone. The grim task of finding and identifying the dead. Leaving the fallen where they lay wasn't an option. Disease, morale, and military order all demanded action. But recovering and identifying thousands of bodies in an active war zone wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible under the circumstances. The first attempts to recover the dead began within hours of the battle ending in certain areas. Medics and support troops who had survived were among the first to start gathering bodies, but their primary focus was still on the living, those who could be saved. The dead, however, couldn't be ignored for long. The incoming tide on the beaches threatened to carry away many of the fallen. Bodies left in the open sun quickly began to decay. Something had to be done, and fast. The U.S. military had procedures in place for handling battlefield deaths, but Normandy presented an unprecedented challenge. The sheer scale of the invasion meant that thousands of bodies had to be accounted for while combat was still ongoing. The responsibility fell largely to the Graves Registration Service, JRS, a unit specifically tasked with recovering, identifying, and burying American casualties. These men had one of the hardest jobs of the war, not just physically but emotionally. Under enemy fire, GRS personnel worked as efficiently as possible. Bodies were tagged, documented, and transported to designated collection points. When possible, soldiers' dog tags provided immediate identification. But it wasn't always that simple. Some bodies were unrecognizable due to explosions, fire, or injuries that made standard identification impossible. Others had lost their dog tags, making it necessary to rely on personal effects, notes found in pockets, or even dental records when those were available. One of the biggest challenges was separating Allied and German bodies. In the chaos of war, uniforms were often damaged, covered in dirt or blood, making it difficult at first glance to determine friend from foe. German dead were usually handled differently, often buried in separate areas or left for their own forces to retrieve when possible. But even for Allied soldiers, identification was not always guaranteed. If a body was too far gone or lacked any identifying marks, it was classified as unknown. These unknown soldiers were buried with dignity, but their names would remain lost to history unless future efforts could uncover their identities. Despite the grim nature of the work, those involved in body recovery took it seriously. Many were soldiers themselves who had lost comrades and understood the importance of giving each man a proper burial. The psychological toll, however, was severe. Some GRS members suffered breakdowns from the endless exposure to death, the stench of decaying bodies, the sight of mutilated corpses, and the weight of handling fellow soldiers' remains haunted many for the rest of their lives. And yet this was only the beginning of the process. Once the bodies were recovered and temporarily buried, another major challenge loomed: finding a way to give these fallen soldiers a final permanent resting place. The race against time, temporary graves in the chaos of war. Recovering the fallen was just the first step. Once their bodies were pulled from the beaches, the fields, and the cliffs, a new question arose: where do you put thousands of dead soldiers in the middle of an ongoing war? The answer was neither perfect nor permanent, but it was the only option: temporary burial sites. With combat still raging and no time for elaborate ceremonies, the priority was to bury the bodies as quickly and respectfully as possible. Soldiers and graves registration teams worked under extreme conditions, often using whatever tools they could find, sometimes even their bare hands, to dig makeshift graves. In many cases, burial sites were established near the battlefields where the men had fallen, sometimes just a few hundred yards from enemy positions. These graves varied in size. Some were individual burials, marked hastily with wooden crosses or helmets. Others were mass graves, dug quickly to accommodate dozens of bodies at once. The locations were carefully documented to ensure they could be revisited later, but in the chaos of war, some of these graves were lost or disturbed by continued fighting. For many soldiers, digging graves was just as mentally taxing as it was physically exhausting. They were burying men they had fought beside only hours before. The emotional weight of this task left deep scars on those who carried it out. Some later admitted that they barely processed what they were doing at the time. The focus was on survival and moving forward, but once the war slowed down, the realization of what they had been part of hit them hard. Temporary cemeteries also faced logistical challenges. Some areas were impossible to dig into due to rocky terrain. Other times, bodies had to be exhumed and reburied when battle lines shifted, putting the original sites in danger of being destroyed or falling into enemy hands. In rare cases, soldiers' remains were relocated multiple times before reaching their final resting places. Despite the rush, efforts were made to preserve dignity. Chaplains were often present at these burials, offering brief prayers for the fallen. In some cases, small ceremonies were held when time allowed. Even in the brutality of war, there was a universal understanding that these men deserved respect, but these were only temporary solutions. The true goal was to ensure that every soldier had a final, permanent resting place. That process, however, would take years to complete. From makeshift graves to sacred ground, the creation of permanent cemeteries. Temporary burials may have been a necessary wartime solution, but they were never meant to be final. The soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy had given everything, and the military knew that their sacrifices deserved more than a hastily dug grave in a battlefield. As the war moved forward, a massive effort was launched to create permanent cemeteries, places where the fallen could be honored for generations to come. The task of establishing these cemeteries fell largely to the American Battle Monuments Commission, ABMC, which had been managing U.S. military cemeteries since World War I. Their mission was clear: to locate, exhume, and properly rebury every fallen soldier who had been buried in temporary sites across Normandy and beyond. But this was no easy task. The first step was locating all the makeshift burial grounds. While many had been carefully recorded by the Graves Registration Service, others were harder to find. Some graves had been disturbed by continued fighting, while others had been lost in the chaos of advancing troops. In some cases, civilians who had buried fallen soldiers near their homes or farms helped provide information. Once bodies were exhumed, identification became a priority. Many soldiers had been buried in haste, often with only a dog tag or a simple marker. The graves registration teams worked tirelessly to confirm identities, using everything from dental records to personal belongings. For the unknown soldiers who could not be identified, the decision was made to bury them with full honors, their graves marked with the simple inscription, "Here rests in honored glory, a comrade in arms known but to God." After identification, the next step was reinterment. The most famous of these final resting places is the Normandy American Cemetery, located on a bluff overlooking Omaha Beach. Established in 1944 and officially dedicated in 1956, it became the largest and most well-known U.S. military cemetery in Europe. Covering 172 acres, it contains the graves of over 9,000 American soldiers, each marked by a white marble cross or Star of David. But Normandy was not the only place where D-Day's fallen found their final rest. Other cemeteries, like the Brittany American Cemetery and the Cambridge American Cemetery in England, also received reburied soldiers. These locations were chosen carefully, ensuring that fallen troops remained close to where they had fought and died. Families of the deceased were given a choice. They could have their loved ones buried in a permanent overseas cemetery, or they could request their remains be brought back to the United States for burial in a national cemetery or private plot. About 60% of families chose repatriation, while the remaining 40% allowed their relatives to be laid to rest where they had fallen, ensuring that Europe would always remember the cost of its liberation. The soldiers who buried the soldiers, graves registration units. But locating and reburying the fallen wasn't just about honor, it was an organized military operation of its own. Behind the scenes, away from the front lines, a specialized group of soldiers had one of the most emotionally difficult jobs of the war: recovering, identifying, and properly burying the dead. These were the men of the Graves Registration Service, JRS, the unsung heroes of D-Day's aftermath. Unlike combat troops, GRS units weren't trained to fight. Their mission was entirely focused on handling the dead, and their work began almost immediately after a battle ended. They had to navigate still dangerous battlefields, often under sporadic sniper fire or artillery, while carefully recovering bodies before they deteriorated beyond recognition. The stench of death, the sight of mangled corpses, and the sheer scale of loss were things they had to face daily. Once a body was recovered, the first priority was identification. If a soldier still had his dog tags, the process was straightforward. If not, Graves registration teams had to search for any clue: letters, photographs, laundry marks on uniforms, or even dental records, anything that could help confirm the person's identity. If no identification was possible, the body was classified as unknown and buried with dignity, awaiting possible future recognition. Beyond retrieval and identification, the GRS was also responsible for organizing temporary and permanent burials. The unit would locate suitable ground, dig rows of graves, and ensure each soldier received a proper burial, even if it was a simple wooden cross or marker at first. Chaplains were sometimes present to perform last rites. The military saw this process as not just a necessity but a moral duty. Every soldier deserved to be honored, no matter how chaotic the situation. GRS teams didn't just handle American bodies, they also had to manage the remains of enemy soldiers. German bodies were often buried separately, but unlike American and Allied troops, they were not always given marked graves, especially early in the war. Some German soldiers were left in battlefield mass graves, only to be properly reburied years later. The work was exhausting, both physically and mentally. Many GRS members suffered from what we now understand as psychological trauma. Handling death so intimately day after day wore down even the toughest men. Some became desensitized, treating their work mechanically to avoid emotional collapse. Others couldn't cope and had to be reassigned. And yet their work remains one of the most overlooked but essential aspects of the war. Without them, thousands of soldiers might have remained lost, unaccounted for, or buried in unmarked graves. Lost to history, the struggle to identify the fallen. But even with the best efforts of the Graves registration units, not every soldier could be identified. The brutal conditions of D-Day, relentless machine gun fire, artillery barrages, and the chaos of battle meant that many bodies were unrecognizable or missing critical identification markers. Some soldiers simply vanished, their remains never found. The process of identifying the dead was a race against time, but it was far from perfect. The most obvious method of identification was dog tags, but this system had major flaws. Many soldiers had their tags ripped away in explosions, lost in the water, or removed by comrades who hoped to inform the fallen's family later. Others had only a single tag on them, while the other was left on the battlefield or taken by the enemy. Without dog tags, the identification process became painstakingly difficult. Personal belongings like letters, photographs, or inscribed jewelry sometimes provided clues, but these weren't always reliable. Uniforms were often shredded, burned, or missing entirely, leaving no immediate sign of rank or nationality. Facial recognition was almost impossible. The nature of D-Day combat, close-range gunfire, aerial bombings, and naval shelling meant that many bodies were too damaged to be identified visually. In some cases, soldiers had to be identified by distinctive scars, tattoos, or even dental records, assuming those records were available. One of the biggest challenges was dealing with bodies that had been in the water. Many soldiers drowned when their landing craft sank, their bodies washing up days or even weeks later. The ocean made identification even harder as exposure to salt water accelerated decomposition. Some of these men were never identified at all, their final records simply stating that they were lost at sea. Another issue was mass graves. In the heat of battle, temporary mass graves were sometimes dug to clear the battlefield quickly. Later, when bodies were exhumed for reburial in permanent cemeteries, it wasn't always clear which remains belonged to whom, especially if dog tags or identifying items had been lost in the process. Even after the war, thousands of soldiers remained missing in action, MIA, their fates unknown. Some were later identified through advances in forensic science, but others were never found. Today, efforts continue to match unidentified remains with modern DNA technology, offering some families long-awaited closure. The struggle to identify every fallen soldier was a painful reality of war. Despite all efforts, some names would never be matched to a grave, their final moments lost to history, but even for those who were never identified, their sacrifice was never forgotten. The voices of D-Day, stories from those who were there, but statistics and military reports only tell part of the story. The real weight of D-Day's aftermath comes from the men who were there, those who fought, survived, and, in some cases, were tasked with handling the dead. Their personal accounts reveal the raw and often haunting reality of what happened on those beaches. One soldier, a medic named Ray Lambert, recalled the horror of trying to save the wounded while surrounded by bodies. As he moved from one injured man to the next, bullets flew overhead, and the tide slowly crept up, carrying the fallen out to sea. There was no time to stop, he later wrote. If they were gone, they were gone. If they were alive, we did what we could. For those assigned to recovery efforts, the emotional toll was immense. Sergeant James O'Donnell, a member of the Graves Registration Service, described the grim process of collecting the dead from Omaha Beach. "We worked through the night stacking bodies like firewood," he said. "Some men couldn't take it and had to be pulled off the detail." Even after the battle, locals in Normandy witnessed the overwhelming number of fallen soldiers. French civilians, many of whom had been caught in the crossfire, helped where they could. An elderly woman from Colville-sur-Mer later recounted how her family buried 2 American paratroopers in their garden, marking the graves with wooden crosses until the military came for them. "We didn't know their names," she said, "but we knew they had died for us." There were also stories of eerie silence in the days after the invasion. Soldiers who walked the beaches after the fighting had moved inland spoke of the unsettling quiet. Private John McGowan described it as the loudest silence I ever heard, just the waves, the wind, and thousands of boys who weren't going home. Not all the memories were tragic. Some soldiers found small moments of humanity amid the chaos. One story tells of a group of American troops who stumbled upon a wounded German soldier among the dead. Instead of leaving him behind, they carried him to a medic station, ensuring he had a chance to survive. "He was the enemy," one soldier said, "but he was also just a kid." The unfinished story, how D-Day's fallen are remembered. But the story of D-Day doesn't end with the battle or even the burials. The sacrifices made that day left an indelible mark on history, and the way the world remembers the fallen has shaped how we understand war, loss, and honor. The most visible tribute to those who died on June 6, 1944, is the Normandy American Cemetery, where thousands of white crosses and stars of David stretch across a peaceful bluff overlooking Omaha Beach. It stands as a reminder of what was lost, a stark contrast to the violent chaos that unfolded there decades ago. Each year, thousands of visitors, family members, historians, and tourists come to pay their respects, ensuring that the memory of those who fought and died is never forgotten. Beyond the physical cemeteries, D-Day is commemorated through memorials, museums, and ceremonies. The annual remembrance events in France, attended by world leaders and veterans, serve as a powerful reminder of the unity forged through sacrifice. These ceremonies include flyovers, reenactments, and moments of silence, honoring not only those who died but also those who survived and carried the weight of that day for the rest of their lives. The legacy of D-Day also lives on through stories and education. Schools, documentaries, and even modern podcasts, like Joe Rogan's discussions on the topic, help keep these memories alive. The personal accounts of soldiers preserved in interviews and books make sure that history remains more than just numbers and dates. They give names, faces, and emotions to the past, making it real for future generations. But remembrance isn't just about looking back. It's about recognizing how the world was shaped by the events of that day. The victory at Normandy helped bring an end to World War II, and the sacrifices made there contributed to the freedoms that many take for granted today. Without that pivotal battle, history could have taken a very different course. And perhaps that's why D-Day remains one of the most studied and honored events in military history. It was more than just a battle, it was a defining moment for an entire generation. And as long as people continue to visit the cemeteries, tell the stories, and honor the dead, the legacy of those who fell on June 6, 1944 will never fade.